Hello everyone, as Liam said, I'm John Loder, and I'd like to welcome you to this session on digital health and citizen science. We've got a fantastic panel who I'm really excited about, so I'm going to speak for a very short time and so they can speak for as long as possible. What I am going to say is that here at Nesta we believe there's a massive opportunity presented by the data that's generated by bits of kit that we all carry around with us. And we believe that it can help people take control of their own health in a very different way than they've been able to do before. And we believe that it can generate insights into what works and what doesn't, and answer questions that we haven't been able to really answer at all. And we have three kind of real experts on this kind of developing field. So that's all from me to kick off, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen Friend, who is the president of Sage BioNetworks, and whose bio is much too long for me to go into detail, but is in the conference materials if you want to have a look. So, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thanks. A pleasure. I'm going to start out and give a context, give some compare-contrasts. Last night when I wanted to go over to Nesta, I used a device I take for granted, but the point is it allowed me to navigate. It allowed me to get from one place to another, and we take that for granted. At the same time, we do not take for granted the ability to actually look at our progress between health and disease. And I'm going to argue that in the next years, we need to have that. If we're going to make an impact, we need to have a way to do that type of navigation. The second thing I want to set as context is there are branches of medicine where we get quantitative information. When you go to a radiologist, you get quantitative information that's based within the hospital. When you go and have a whole genome sequence done on a bacteria, that's done in a hospital, and that quantitative information guides diagnosis, guides care. Recently, there have been ways to take some of those quantitative measures outside of hospitals so that you can go for looking at a diabetic and use a glucometer outside the hospital. Similarly, for asthma, an example where you can go outside of a hospital and measure that. So I want to break diseases down into those where those quantitative measurements are generated by machines in the medical complexes, those that are actually escaping, where a patient can generate that on their own, that quantitative. But what I'm really interested in is this bottom category. I'm really interested in what it is that would allow you to get quantitative measures on things that up until now we've never been able to measure, where there are qualitative measures, neurologic and psychiatric diseases, things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. What if you could actually not just have contour maps, but you could also do that of diseases such as Alzheimer's, such as Parkinson's? To do that, we have to fundamentally change how it is that we collect information. If we have an opportunity to take pervasive computing devices, and we have 1 billion of those out there on the planet, it gives us an ability to have a denominator that's great, instead of every couple of months, all the time, real-time information, allows hundreds to thousands of dimensions, and it allows it to be machine readable. More importantly, what we've noticed is if you take current ways that people are tracked and you have smartphone measures, you have lots of examples in all of these. But the most important thing is what we've realized is the medieval concept of a subject in a trial is not ever going to work. Once you start treating individuals as participants, once you start saying, you are a partner, I want your information, and instead of using apps as self-gratifying loops, you have a way where that data is actually helping another and working together, where there's a way to treat the researcher and the individual as a participant, as an equal in that. It starts to get interesting. 11 months ago, actually to the day, Apple rolled out a series of ways that you could do clinical trials, research-driven clinical trials using smartphone apps. And it has ways to have consent and surveys and passive data. And importantly, all these are stored as open code. So someone who's used one place can drop it in as a module to do another. I want to drill down on one of these. I want to drill down on one Parkinson, not because I'm in London, not because 11 months from now we're going to be at the 200th anniversary of James's figuring out the Parkinson, but it's very interesting because it has a lot of movement-related symptoms, which are all qualitative. What we did was we built into apps a way to have surveys, but much more importantly, we used various active tasks to allow someone all the time to say, this is what's happening to my disease. And if we have a chance later, I'll talk about how we also can do that passively. The fun thing is that within a couple of weeks, we had more patients enrolled than anyone had enrolled in any Parkinson trial. We had 1,700 with Parkinson's disease, and over 3/4 of these patients said, I want to control the data, and I want to share it with everyone as qualified researchers. What did we learn? We learned that diseases, chronic diseases that we take for granted as having some sort of a slope, have no slope at all when it comes to an individual. On a day-to-day basis, if you look at where a patient is pre and post meds, this is shown in red and blue, over a 3-month interval, look at the fluctuation. It's not just the fluctuation pre, but the effects of the medication. If you go in and you take, for example, gait, we can get 1,000 dimensions of information, and we can use statistical tools that allow us to find out the things that for that person are the most informative for that particular person to track. And that gives us a level of resolution that's remarkable. But where it gets interesting is if you take the same patient, here's 30, rank ordered for tapping, and you ask, what about the other features of the disease? Look at how variable it is. Each person has a characteristic way that they're going through that disease, which if you could monitor that, is something that gives you a different level of certainty, a different way to help that person. At the same time, we can go in and look at the effects pre-post medication, which I'm going to skip for anyone who wants to talk about that again later. This is what blew our minds. We also said, hey, what's making you better? What's making you worse? Not just what are your symptoms. And what we got were these streams of information which were not about medication. Sometimes they were about sleep, sometimes they were about exercise, but here's the key point. Someone's disease is being influenced by what is happening to them in their day. Sometimes it's something that happened to their dog. Sometimes it's having to move. We need to get to the point when we're working with individuals, notice I didn't say patients, with individuals, that we can actually follow what are those things, not just their symptoms, if we're going to learn how to have a future of medicine. So in conclusion, there's some interesting directions we can go. One is we can use these tools to have a way of pre-enrolling patients in clinical trials, secondary endpoints, but very interesting ways. Imagine how we could use this for post-approval. And we've been talking to the EMA and the FDA on how could you use this to follow patients for symptoms they didn't even know they were going to get. The second is we've gone to lots of other types of symptoms and diseases. So we worked with 4 or 5 original ones. Now there's a whole suite of symptom modules that have come up in ResearchKit that you could use to follow any number of diseases. Importantly, we've been building an ecosystem where people can go and put all their data for others to work on. So Sage has a system called Synapse, and in the next 2 weeks, and these are articles that are in press coming out, 3 articles in Nature, there are the Nature publishing groups. We're going to put all the data out there for anyone in the world to make insights and learn from each other because we think we have to foster that type of community. The hope is that we're going to exit the age where people flying blind between when they're at a physician's office. People were choosing between, do I want more data or do I want better ways of patients to work together? Guess what? What happens if that's the same statement and different sides of the same statement? So in conclusion, people-powered health should not be a choice of how do I engage peers? It shouldn't be a choice of do we need more data? The beauty is when we begin to put the pieces together, the traditional doctor, the researcher, the patients as peers working together to give insights, and then something that's a new character called a knowledge expert, which all that data is gives you insights you couldn't otherwise have. Thanks.
There's a huge amount to pick up on there, but we're going to hear next, I think, from Deborah Estrin, who is both Professor of Computer Science and of Public Health at Cornell Tech.
So thrilled to be following you, Stephen. As you described, we're drawn to this question: how can we take data-driven techniques and develop data-driven techniques for user modeling and even things like preference profiling and engagement to help us, if you will, my one tweet, sort of close the gap between what we're born with and what we die from. So the genomics revolution is hugely important and is continuing to contribute a huge amount, but it's just not enough, particularly when you think back to everything we know about behaviors driving preventable chronic disease and mortalities. One way to think about the type of data that Stephen was describing for the sake of research is that it fills feedback loops of health. This feedback loop of health, of evidence about what works best in different contexts, what's the level of variability that different patients sees, but also the feedback loops of health as individuals take care of themselves and better understand what works for them. Better answer the question, am I feeling 10% less pain than I was 2 weeks ago? It's a very difficult question to answer, but it's relevant if you're trying to figure out whether to continue a particular course of therapy or to try something else, whether to continue your CBT to get better sleep, or whether sleep hygiene isn't what's driving your symptoms. And of course, clinical care. So as it comes to whether it's drug titration or other sorts of treatment adjustment, to far better be able to answer those what are now retrospective recall questions that a clinician asks you when they've adjusted your medication and they're trying to identify if it's effective. And the type of data that we're talking about are the sorts of active tasks that Stephen's referred to, as well as other passive forms of data. And these, while James will refer to many other things coming along in the wearable space, there are many things right now that are data that we already generate. So on our smartphones, we generate continuously location and activity traces. And if you had to choose one data stream that's currently available very prevalently, that is very rich in information that's relevant to many different conditions, that would be at the top of my list. And it's not just about whether you've met your goal of 10,000 steps today. It has many more disease-relevant things like, have there been shifts in your location patterns over time? Have there been shifts in what time you get to work? How many hours you spend out of the house on the weekend? And have those things shifted as you've been going through this course of treatment? And that sort of thing can provide early feedback on a sign of a relapse or some adverse side effect, or even indication that a patient is in fact steadily improving and has improved 10% over the last 2 months, and the current course of physical therapy or social engagement is in fact working well. Now, add to things like mobility and activity are lots of other digital traces we generate almost continuously. And that includes the things we buy, the language we use in our emails and texts and tweets, and even the applications we use, and to what extent we're using them even as another form of self-medication or sleep interference, as you might have it, whether for you that's Netflix binging or YouTube binging or Huffington Post, or for me, living in New York and obsessed with trying to find a place to live, it's Street Easy. I don't know if that's something you guys use here. So in all of these cases, though, of these existing data streams, they are there. They do describe us. There's face value that appeal that, yes, they say something about my state of mind and state of health. But the challenge is in taking those raw data measures and converting them into something that's meaningful, to get rid of the noise, to summarize them, to fuse them, to combine them, so that we really have a kind of patient-person functional measure. And while a lot of these can share building blocks, there's also specialization across the particular conditions. So the good news is that there's a lot of opportunity for shared learning and shared infrastructure. Just as with the internet and the web, we had a modular open architecture that allowed all the boats to float higher. And when you have that kind of open architecture, you get to move the state of the art faster than we can barely keep up with. And clearly, open is not counter to very successful commercialization, which we've seen in droves when it comes to web services and the internet. And we can see again in this space. And ResearchKit and Open mHealth are examples of building a community, having a place where we can nurture open architecture, standards, semantics, and syntax that grow as we develop new types of measurements and new applications. I just want to conclude by making a point that came up at a meeting last week. Somebody was asking me why, with all these years, decades actually, of effort put into clinical informatics, did I still have so many great expectations and energy for this particular space? And my response was that we really do have a new shot at transformation because of the growing focus of creative, adaptive, smart technologies designed for patients to solve patients' problems, rather than starting with a mindset that we're solving clinicians' problems. So I was so delighted to come to this meeting. And as a last point there, I'll circle around to where Stephen started his talk and say that it's not about changing people's lives because you give them raw data. For the most part, raw data is not going to change an individual's lives or change the way that a carer takes care of them. They will not be helped by data in the raw. They're going to be helped by applications that are fueled by their data. So to be concrete, in the old days, we had GPS handheld devices. They looked something like this, okay? But they were mostly used by the military and some nerds. But now, almost every one of us here uses Google Maps. And that app is informed by your small personal data, where you are at the moment, where you want to go, how you might have traveled there before, is what informs the map giving you that service. And that's the sort of patient-powered, data-driven tools we need to give to patients to help them care for themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. And our last speaker is James Levine, who is Professor of Medicine at the Mayo Clinic, a professor for about 3 different things, and also, I believe, a prize-winning novelist.
There are worse things in the world. All right, so I'm going to really bring this down to a really sort of totally granular level and talk about the MEMS triaxial accelerometer chip. Now, the same chip is in sort of fashion wearables that track your activity, but also can be deployed in research-grade devices. So to compare and contrast, the fashion wearable, the hypothesis being addressed when a fashion wearable is built by a newco or by a big company is the hypothesis is how many can I sell? That is the hypothesis. And the data that are generated thereby are not necessarily valid, they're not necessarily filtered, controlled or regulated. But really the focus is on cachet and sort of looking cool and so on and so forth. And the idea is to have a mass market appeal. In stark contrast, remember using exactly the same chip or a very similar chip. That same chip can be used for a research-grade device that has been carefully validated for very specific application, for, in this example, in patients with congestive heart failure, and has been validated. The data are regulated, very carefully filtered. The entire process is controlled. The device is worn in a very specific way, and so on and so forth. Now that device has no market appeal. I mean, you wouldn't want one. However, was used in a 23-center randomized clinical controlled trial to assess what is the best way medications can be used in congestive heart failure patients, and was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the point being here is this type of data directly influence very specific elements of human medical care. And on one hand, you've got fashionables, on the other hand, you've got research-grade equipment, and of course, there's everything in between. Now, the dichotomy therein, there are substantial investment implications for this. By investment, I don't mean financial investment in terms of building new companies, so on and so forth. But what I'm talking about is strategic investment. If you're in a healthcare system, what sort of resource investment, policy investment. in that research wearable example, in that part of the dichotomy, you can understand that the investment there would be to understand how better to look after patients, the patient you're talking about, whether that's part of a pharma platform to better understand drug efficiency, efficacy, and drug delivery, whether that's part of healthcare evaluation to better spend the NHS pound per patient in terms of effectiveness. The other, looking again, compare and contrast that to the fashion wearable, what are the implications there in terms of investments? Now, interestingly, if the hypothesis is to sell, you might appreciate, therefore, that the investment strategy in terms is actually a marketing concept. And these devices are marketed completely differently to in the health space. For example, there's Snyder's hope theory. Snyder's hope theory is this idea is that if I want to achieve something, I do so in a stepwise fashion. And by taking a step, I've moved towards my health. So buying a wearable moves me towards health. Vicarious goal fulfillment is totally brilliant. Vicarious goal fulfillment is this idea that if I buy a device to improve my health, I've done something good and my brain gives me a reward, so that by buying a device, I can now go to McDonald's and eat a hamburger. It's exactly the concept. And the third concept often used in marketing these kind of devices is terror management theory. Now, terror management theory is an idea that all of us, whilst living, are continuously challenged by the concept that we're going to die. Sorry, a little bit morose, but there we go. And this is exploited, for example, in car advertisements. We see the car sort of rearing on very dangerous streets in order for the individuals to get home to their family. These are the kind of marketing approaches used to sell devices. So in other words, it's nothing to do with health outcomes, but it's to do with sales outcomes. And this dichotomy continuously exists. Now, in order to actually start to bring this together as we start to think through the future, please understand that the sensors that we're currently available to us are nothing as compared to what's going to happen in the future. There are going to be 1,000 sensors for 1,000 applications. The Band-Aid I've got here has 15 channels to measure different things in my bloodstream continuously, hydration, glucose, so on and so forth. Implantables are coming with 17 channels of measurement continuously over years. So there are going to be many, many more types of sensors. If you like, the goose that laid the golden egg is ultimately going to be that data analysis and integration, because the information is going to be coming from highly regulated sources all the way down to completely unregulated sources. So working out how to filter and integrate that information is obviously tremendously valuable. And what are the standards and data transfer protocols going to be to achieve that? Once one has the data, then the outputs become incredibly interesting and important, whether those are healthcare, the scholarship we just talked about, services, and of course ultimately sales if you're a new building a new type of device. And so as we start to think about wearable health, my point would be is that there are many, many channels of input and there are many channels of opportunity. But my plea at the end of this brief interaction with you is to remember that as ultimately sort of by reductionist thinking we become numbers, my plea is that we actually remember that we are people. Thank you.
So thank you guys for three really fascinating kind of short talks, and I know you could all have gone on for much, much longer, and so I apologise for constraining you to these within this very short timescale. I'd like to start by picking up on a kind of contrast between some of the things that James is saying, the kind of danger of a world of apps that fundamentally don't help patients that much, and perhaps a more utopian vision that's in all three of the talks, where we're producing things that do very high quality data analysis on very high quality data that really does help people. And I guess I kind of want to ask you, how do we get to the good world and not to the bad one? How do we realize the positive vision of really active communities and high quality apps and data, and not the kind of fashion wearables that are spitting out stuff that's neither accurate nor helpful? So what do we need to do, I suppose is my question. Who wants to start?
I guess I'll start, but no, I'll pass it on. We have to do a really odd thing, and that is start with the person who is interested in their health and disease for the purpose of understanding themselves. Where it's for sales, where it's for research papers, you're not going to get to the end. So I actually think that in many of the things that I think all three of us said, there is this odd idea that the person that should be at the center is not someone who's doing necessarily an NHS study. It's not someone who's trying to sell a device. It's actually going directly to individuals. And I think there have to be ways to engage, this phrase peer-to-peer, there has to be a way to engage with those individuals. So one of the things we did on the research kit apps, I talked about developing the symptoms. I also talked about the modulators. The other thing we did was we had a screen where we said, hey, how would you make this better? And we got thousands, we got actually more than 10,000 responses. I hate this, you shouldn't be doing this. If you ask the person, they will tell you. So I think it's odd, but it's not going to the researcher, it's not going to the scientist, it's going directly to the patient. And then the hard thing with that odd is actually, it's this dialogue that goes on between the clinician and the caregiver and the individual that actually also has to go on. If you just go completely focusing on the individual and you don't talk to the caregiver and you don't talk to what the need is of the clinician. So that last slide, which had the clinician, et cetera, I think, but remember, right at the center, ask the person.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Deborah.
I'll take it on a little more head on. Even though I said I wasn't going to argue with you up here, I will.
I love argument.
Which is just that what you said is true, right? That the nature of those consumer devices have not begun to be validated, but it's not necessarily just noise. And if in combination with the excellent research where people do very careful, rigorous measurements with that scientific instrument, you can establish ways in which the consumer device gives the individual caregiver, clinician, back some trending on how they're doing. And the difference between something needing to be diagnostic grade is different from, does it give some feedback signal to the general direction in which things are going, up, down, level of variability. And that's where the potential for these things, what's the big difference between them is that they're cheap, is that they're affordable, they're mass produced, and therefore can affect a lot more people's lives. So from that perspective, I would say there's really important room for both.
I think one of the, so to answer your point and John's question, so to me, I don't think much of this matters too much, quite honestly, because really what's actually happening out there is that you actually have market force, which is actually consumer driven, whether the consumer is the healthcare market or the consumer is actually people buying things off shelves. And responding to that is probably 400 or 500 new codes that have started up building technology. These technologies invariably aren't necessarily driven by accuracy, precision, but ultimately the consumer utility, the utilitarian model, ultimately defines what the use of these kind of things proves to be. The implications of this kind of market-driven approach, because indeed prices are coming down. A 15 device Band-Aid is pricing out at about 30 cents, about 15p. And a Fitbit is about 10 or 100 times more than that. And so the implications of this on sort of world health ultimately is going to be enormous. And often it's what question are you asking? So when we do a lot of these kind of data mushes, one of the questions we ask is, who's bought the device? The self-interested individual. Why is that person different to other people? When are they wearing the device? And how often are they wearing it? And when do they give up wearing it? How often do they log on? So these data are very, very clean. But the question is, what question are you asking?
And we could, just to kind of pull out, I think for the purposes of a discussion that we've all had before, the quality, I think, of the data that modern devices are presently able to pull up and will be able to pull up in the future is pretty high. The quality of the analysis that we can do on that data is probably the big question. Can we extract really useful insights from that? But I guess rather than getting into the kind of sensors and biosensors debate, the question that I want to pursue this issue in this session about people power, about the kinds of people who get engaged in this sort of work. So I think one of the accusations is often, well, this is all well and good, but you're really talking about a really geeky minority who love technology, and actually, the mass of patients out there won't want to record their data. They won't feel comfortable sharing it, and they want that kind of old school human interaction. And I wondered what you'd sort of say in response to that criticism from your own kind of direct experience. Should we start with Deborah for in the middle for a change?
First of all, maybe a decade ago, maybe 5 years ago, we would have had the conversation about whether anybody will use anything other than text messaging and whether it was appropriate to do anything other than text messaging. And most people wouldn't have smartphones and download apps. A few days ago, I was giving a small talk in somebody's home, and there was a quite elderly gentleman sitting in front of me, and in the middle of the talk, his phone rang. And he reached into his jacket and pulled out his iPhone. And he was 96 years old. Now, I grant you he was quite an exception, but it has proliferated beyond what we thought because applications appeal to people, the ones that they use, like Google Maps, and that has changed the bar in terms of what people want to do. And people share a lot of data with the providers of those applications because the applications provide them with utility. I wish they would share less. They don't, right? And so I don't think, though, that we should say that there's nothing left for privacy, I'm almost done, and that there's no control of sharing. In fact, that's exactly what ResearchKit got right, and I forgot. We are now getting the Android equivalent done for those people who can't afford the twice as expensive iPhone. But what ResearchKit got exactly right is that consent process and the assumption that the data stays on the individual's phone and they are the one to make the decision. And when they make the decision, it's not that they are saying that they're sharing identified data with the world. They don't have to agree to put it up on Facebook. They agree that they're sharing it with clinicians and in a de-identified form, sharing it with the larger research community.
Great, thanks. Stephen says, have you got similar experience?
I will, and it's a nice compliment off of what Deb was saying. I think it's artificial to separate, do you want privacy or do you want sharing? That is it polarizes. So encrypted data can be stored on your phone, pulled off, separated. In fact, the data that is personal information never goes near the stored study data that is coded, that is what people want to share. They don't want to share their personal information. That's a privacy issue. If you separate that from the beginning, you encrypt that, I think that debate doesn't need to go on. And the other thing that I think is very important is we have found that the major thing that determines whether someone wants to start and engage on having information is whether it's doing them any good. Most apps that people use, they find are not helpful. They stop using them because someone goes, okay, I already get it. I know what I'm doing. If you get to the point where you're able to say for someone's arthritis or for someone's Alzheimer's disease, this is what's making a difference in your disease, and you're writing that down and you're tracking it, that what we find is people are using this 7 times a day, more times than we ask, because they're getting something from it. So give someone back something, make it so that privacy is not the difference from sharing, and I think there's an opportunity to go places.
And James, I'll ask you to comment on that, but also I think, and this is going to be my last question that I'm going to get in before we open up to the floor, just to think a little bit about where you see this, with a more optimistic kind of hat on, and we've covered some of the risks. What do you think the potential of the kind of data generated by people's devices in a day-to-day way is looking sort of 5 or 10 years out into the future?
I see no pessimism at all. I mean, all the other things can be dealt with. Simple example. Two simple examples. First of all, when you use Facebook, you share your data. That's the deal. Second example. Tasked to deliver a diabetes prevention program to 3 million people in Mexico City, underserved individuals in Mexico City. 3 million individuals get a Band-Aid. That Band-Aid senses people with pre-diabetes who have pre-existing diabetes. That data is sent via cell phones to the community health nurses who then deliver the interventions. I mean, without the Band-Aid, you don't get the program. I mean, it's a self-evident truth. And and sort of in the same way, sort of when one goes to the doctor and the nurse practitioner does your blood pressure, whatever it may be, we don't sort of go crazy about the fact that the data goes into an EMR because we know that there are protections on the electronic medical record. I mean, the reality is the future is going to look very different to the present. And we're either going to, and quite frankly, that train has left the station, right? We're not going to put the train back in the station. So you're either going to sort of get on board and be part of the new world, and we're going to embrace privacy and all ethics and so on and so forth, but the new world's coming, so we might as well wake up. And the opportunities for world health are, here in the UK, civilized country, the NHS is incredible. But we were just talking, I've worked in DRC, I've worked in the slums in Mumbai, I've worked in the slums in Kenya, in Nairobi. I mean, the opportunities for world health, real-time water testing, real-time conversion to STDs, because we can do ELISAs with picomoles on the fly. I mean, the opportunities for world health are unimaginable. So we've got to grasp this because there's a world of opportunity out there.
Thank you, James. And I'd like to ask you two the same question. Where do you see this, the trend, the outcomes of all of this data? What could and should that do for the world, for patients in kind of 5 or 10 years' time? What are your hopes for this field?
It's funny because when I look back 5 or 10 years, I'm surprised how short of a distance the train has moved. And so if I project forward, I can get much more pessimistic, not afraid of the future, but looking forward, I think that I heard a lot of discussion earlier today from, as I was describing, as opposed to in the US, there's a lot of discussion from people in the system and running the system about the things that matter, about wanting to focus on patient carers, about wanting to focus on the environmental and economic factors and food systems that drive a lot of these things. So I think there is the potential with things like ResearchKit and Open mHealth and a way in which this very complex, almost overwhelmingly complex problem of now at the level of the individual, that we can have an ecosystem in a community where you let individuals embrace the technology and the apps to serve them and their carers and their caregivers and their particular problems, but that they don't have to create them themselves. We don't have to wait for them to become data scientists. We can have an ecosystem of tools, of meaning made out of those data that get shared across demographics, geographics, disease conditions. And so if we do it right, we can work together, have that open modular community and really move things forward.
When I come to the UK, to EU, I get jealous of the coordinated, sometimes centralized approaches that are really quite lacking in the US. When I'm in the US, I am struck by the power of individual groups doing things not in a centralized way. And I think this needs a hybrid approach, the way the open and the commercial efforts are going to work here, in that when you're building out, this is very important, when you're building out symptom-based modules, it takes an enormous amount of creativity that should not be coming down in a centralized way. When you're then going and trying to understand what the heck that means, you need to have very large populations and cohorts and finding features that actually really doesn't work when everyone's off trying to do it in a different way. And then you have to go to regulatory scientists because this is health information. This is not, something about entertainment, okay? This is a regulated industry. And in order to have something shift from tracking to guidance, you have to get to the point where you anchor those new insights down with the traditional validated approaches. And that is another thing where you need to have a way of engaging physicians, patients in a much more coalesced way. So I think that if some of the approaches that are going on in the US, some of the approaches that are going on in the UK are not brought together, we're not going to get to some of those utopian descriptions, or at least they'll be like going around on elevated transport vehicles. Hasn't quite made it here yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm resisting the temptation to ask you all more questions myself, but instead I'm going to open to questions from the floor.
Hi, Imran Khan from the British Science Association. A really interesting set of talks. We've been talking mostly about patients as a source of data when it comes to citizen science. I wonder if you could talk about their role as potential scientists themselves. You know, when you've got open data in particular, what are the exciting potential abilities of people? You know, we've seen in medicine in the past that often the most passionate people are the ones who are directly affected by the disease in particular, particularly in rare diseases. So what exciting opportunities do you foresee for patient use of data and active citizen science?
Fantastic. This gentleman over here.
So my name's Tim Walliscroft. I'm a member of the co-production group of the Coalition for Collaborative Care. I'm also doing a PhD that's connects to some related areas. My question's really just kind of linking some of this back to some of the stuff that was discussed in the previous session about complexity and so on. It seems to me that one of the biggest risks at the moment in terms of data is that as we collect more and more data, that you could end up with a situation where there's false certainty. So that ultimately, there's the possibility that by analysing predictive analytics, by analysing data, that you have the possibility that so-called experts can analyse data and say this is what has to happen. Ultimately, it's a question in terms of the tension between a possibility where you could have patients involved purely in terms of data collecting, allowing other people to make decisions, and really making sure that patients are involved in the process from an informed perspective. And actually, for me, that requires a system where you challenge actually the nature of knowledge and data and actually how the whole system works.
Great, thanks very much. And there's a lady with a white shirt on the aisle there.
Hello, my name's Claire MacDonald and I lead on kind of behavioural research projects across public health and NHS. And one of those projects was investing in technology that would reduce obesity and alcohol-related disease. A lot of these innovations were coming from SMEs or spin-outs from universities. And one of the problems we had in a very practical sense was kind of bringing those organisations into the NHS where there's a deep suspicion of the private sector working in, and with things like care.data, shadowing over, integrating the two was incredibly difficult. So really good science, but not being able to get it into the hands of people. So do the British public need a re-education into the possibilities, or is there a sense we may get left behind because of this, wanting to keep private sector out of the NHS?
Fantastic. So 3 questions. One on the role of citizens as kind of active scientists and throwing ideas into the mix. One on false certainty and the, you know, are we in danger of using algorithms to create a sort of to the opposite of what we're hoping for, of creating a barrier between individuals and experts that's perhaps greater than it was in the past? And secondly, the role of the private sector, and how do we I think it's how do we persuade the NHS that it's safe to, and citizens more generally, that it's safe to get involved with private companies in that way? So James, would you like to
all
pick,
3.
Pick one.
Oh, choose one. Okay,
or all 3, just as you choose.
Well, I'll actually pick the last one, mainly because I actually spend a lot of time working out how to integrate private sector with the public sector. It was your question. One response to your question is sort of, drops of water on stone. If you keep dripping, eventually it'll sort of come through. But I think the reality is, so I mean, if you sort of said to me, I've got to go now talk to the head of the NHS and sort of, pitch your problem, so to speak. To me, there's a very clear pitch here. There's an ROI involved. In other words, it's going to be a return on investment. You're talking about healthcare efficiency, you're talking about healthcare outcomes, you're talking about how to utilize resources better and more efficiently. And that is exactly the power of this kind of sort of technological fizz. And in other words, by bringing in the private sector that have both devices, algorithms, and systems, and a systematic approach to addressing given issues, that is actually going to return to the NHS a cost saving and potentially cost return, both in improvement in how the NHS itself functions, but ultimately and more importantly, how patient care is afforded. And to me, that is exactly the sell. And what I would do is, rather than if I was charged to do this, what I would do is not necessarily say, how are we going to bring technology to the NHS, but I'd actually go to patient-associated problems, whether it's obesity, diabetes, alcohol, drugs, whatever it may be, and say, okay, here's the patient. here's the challenge the NHS is facing regarding this patient. Here is a specific solution set that's necessary for that patient. Here are the vendors, and here are the price points, and here's the ROI. And so I'd address it in a very systematic fashion, driven by the patient need, but all focused on ROI.
Great. I mean, that is a famously tough problem, which I wish we had a solution to that we could just
Piece
pop
of
it.
cake. Piece of cake.
Deborah.
I do think that open architectures can help in protecting the public good and the purchaser. It allows you to have things accrete more and build on one another. This, whether it's a small company or a large company, there's more opportunity there for things to build on and be interoperable. And that's an important component of making a public system feel safer. And in the end, you're driving the market to be more efficient, to not go to any one vendor to do a stovepipe solutions, but to actually call to eager vendors to be able to plug in and make those APIs and modular interfaces there. So I think it's a very important role that the public system can play in introducing that into the private market. I just want to touch on one of the other questions, which is I think that we all are in favor of, it won't make it be so, but to the extent you are building applications for people where they are using their data through applications, they have more of an opportunity to see when things are wrong and not representative. And so we have to, from a user experience and other things, figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with the using of the application, but still gives pathways for that. But when we talk about applications that users use that are powered by their data, it doesn't leave the patient out of it. We're talking about bringing it into self-care and shared care as well as clinical care loops. And so I wouldn't toss it aside as being only something where data is informing researchers or data is informing pathways and guidelines.
Just picking up on what Deb just said, I think we would argue that unless there is a transition from participant as medieval subject, I want you to do this for me, okay, and this is my project. That unless we actually have some way where the person is getting real information back and actually are part of asking the questions, it's not going to work. So I'm not worried that this is going to be a problem, because the only apps that are going to be working are going to be those that have 4 levels. The first is giving some direct information, what's going on in terms of assessment. The second is a way to say, what do you think is making you better or worse? The third are questions which are what is it that you think we're not thinking about and that matter to you? And the fourth is what we call a wall of questions, where imagine a Stack Overflow type of set of questions that are coming in from all the people who are using the app, and the one that's rating the highest is sitting there turning in to an experiment that someone is engaged in. And if you don't go through those 4 levels, the apps aren't going to be out there. And so I think 3 years ago people were appropriately going, how's this ever going to work? No one's going to stay on these apps. When you start giving someone real-time information, they're sitting there looking at asking, why are you getting better or worse? You're then able to pose questions, and then your question is coming up as something that you could work on. I think the engagement will kick in ways that we have not seen, because we haven't done it that way.
Great. Fantastic. I'm going to take some Slido questions now. And let's take the first one from Matt Woodburn. Is there a risk that this approach to data collection leads to conclusions in policy making based on a self-selected subgroup of patients? How do we handle that self-selection bias in this kind of work?
In part, that's where there's still a strong role, I think, for publicly funded work to make sure that doesn't happen. And we have both academic and social standards for making that be the case. Now, you will have some level of self-selection by definition, that people who successfully do it are those that are above some bar of engageability with the technology. At this point, though, just remember those conversations about text messaging. That it now includes a very large number of the population, so much so that we can then think about alternative ways of those people for whom this is not an acceptable device, perhaps by instrumenting and giving tools for the carers, not only the individuals themselves.
If anyone wants to chip in on that one, I might go to the second one here. Who do you think should own the data generated, and how do we enable this? I'm going to interpret that as in a robust way. So
let me give you a solution that we have tried. We firmly believe that the phrase "their own" actually is better to use control. Who controls the data? It's a little different, but we think that the patient has to, the participant, the individual has to own that data, and they have to have an ability to say what they want done with it. And so I think that if you give that choice of control to the individual, we get past these paternalistic systems of the experts will say you can't look at that data. And I hope that brings up a dialogue on what patients can handle, what individuals can handle. But I feel strongly about that.
Okay. James, do you have a?
Well, I think again, think of any healthcare system where there's an electronic medical record. These records are carefully regulated by the governmental agencies who oversee, electronic patient care, whether those are in the United States, it's HIPAA. And so there's always, again, there's a tension between the healthcare system who owns the de-identified data and the individual who owns the personal data. And I think one needs to be very context specific. I mean, some data are not personally owned. The population of the UK, we're all members of that population, but somehow there's a lot of personal data that are integrated into the mass. But I think it's the issues of sort of privacy and the identification of a piece of data with me that is important. But of course, healthcare systems operate by collecting and evaluating data en masse.
Great. I'm going to squeeze in one final question from the floor. So who's
hand first up?
Straight in there. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. Jeremy Wyatt from the University of Southampton. I haven't heard anything about the learning healthcare system here. I think that's a model which is taking off in the United States. Do you think it has some value for us in the UK in this context?
You might need to touch briefly on for the rest of the room on what the learning healthcare system really means.
Continuous quality improvement cycles at the level from the patient to the clinical team to the organisation and even the whole nation.
Yes, in fact, it came up at dinner last night, and that was on the tip of my tongue, and I decided that was some American terminology for things that people at the table were talking about doing. In some sense, this is all about creating a learning healthcare system loop, starting at the level of learning what works for that patient and what's important for that patient, informing what's learning, and then the ability to learn across those patients what really matters at this level of granularity. And maybe because there isn't as much of a vested processes that are slow to change, maybe we can make some changes faster out here at the leaves by generating these new types of data and doing this new kind of learning, because we don't have to dislodge as much the older forms of learning. That's sometimes what I take hope in.
Great. Well, we are out of time, so I'm going to end the session by thanking our panelists, Stephen Friend, Deborah, Estrin, and James Levine, for what I think was a really fascinating set of ideas. So thanks a lot, guys.